editor of the Banker magazine. I'm in Davos with Uday Kotak, who's the vice chairman and managing director of Kotak Mahindra Bank. Kotak, the meeting's just begun, but do you already have a sense for what the kind of mood is amongst the delegates and what they're looking to get out of this meeting?
The early sense of the mood I get is there is still concern about how the global economy is doing, and that concern, of course, is more a concern coming out of the US and Europe, and it's essentially around how does this thing play out, what's the risk for sovereign debt, is there too much of sovereign debt, how does the exit happen, and how fragile is this recovery, which has been truly stunning. I mean, last Davos when we met, the mood was extremely gloomy in terms of what happened. Therefore, I think people believe that we are past a crisis, but we are not completely out of the woods.
All right, but you come from, your business is in India, so that's clearly one of the emerging markets that's done very well through the crisis. Can India carry on growing and developing if the West doesn't come back strongly, or are you dependent on everybody coming back for?
I think first of all, when one comes from India into Europe, it feels like two different worlds. The kind of growth impulses we have seen in India over the last 12 months are truly astounding in many ways, because we will grow this year real GDP somewhere between 7 to 7.5%. And the talk for the next year, which is April to March 10-11, the general belief is that India will be at 8% plus GDP growth. Now, you ask yourself the question, what are the components of GDP in India? The bulk of it is domestic demand and domestic consumption. And India's got a domestic savings rate of more than 35%. Therefore, the engine for India's growth is very much domestic. Having said that, on the margin, India does get affected on trade flows as well as capital flows. On trade flows, India has about a 15% export connection with the rest of the world, which is relatively small as a percentage of GDP. And therefore, if there is a slowdown again, India will be less affected than the rest of the world. And on capital flows, I believe exactly the opposite is happening, because the US and European central banks are likely to keep liquidity easy and interest rates low in this cycle, at least for the first half of 2010, which means at those low interest rates, investors will look for growth, and destinations which give growth, like India, will attract capital rather than the other way around. And therefore, in many ways, a sluggish world with easy monetary policy and low growth works to India's advantage.
Okay, and what about the development of the capital markets in India itself? Are you happy with the pace of reform? And also, I think it's quite interesting, do you think that the regulators will start to look at them differently, given the crisis that we've seen in the West? Whereas previously they might have said, well, what works in America is what we're going to try here, but now they may be a bit more skeptical about it.
I think the Indian regulator has, through this entire period of 2005 to 2009, been extremely cautious and has actually implemented counter-cyclical policies, something which I just heard Lord Turner recommending for all policymakers around the world. And India was actually doing it on the ground through this period of 2006 to 2008. Therefore, from the point of view of policy and regulation, if the Western world was at the north end and India was at the extreme south end, I think the northern end is moving closer south, and hopefully the southern end moves closer to the middle.